Great. Good evening, everyone, especially those who are here in the auditorium in person and also virtually to our audiences watching from home. Thank you all for joining us for today's program, which is generously supported by the museum's Friends of Asian Art group. My name is Dani Chan, and I'm the Associate Curator of Asian Art here at the Walters Art Museum. Before we get started, I would like to make the following acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Susquehannock and Piscataway nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. To learn more, please visit the website on the screen. Thank you. So as many of you may know, this season, all of the talks in this series are focused on the museum's Asian and Islamic art collections in celebration of our new galleries across Asia, Arts of Asia and the Islamic World, now on view on the 4th floor. Tonight, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for the lecture, Dr. Jeffrey Moser. Jeff is Assistant Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at Brown University. His research attends broadly to the conceptual and material processes whereby past things are made present, with particular attention to the ways in which these processes intersect in the artistic and scholarly practices of medieval China. His many publications include articles on antiquarianism, ceramics, geography, and the geoaesthetics of rock-cut Buddhist sculpture. His most recent book just came out in April. It's titled Nominal Things, Bronzes in the Making of Medieval China, and it examines the decipherment of ancient bronzes in 11th century China. For tonight's talk, Jeff will examine how one Chinese bronze bell in the Walters collection may actually, quote unquote, embody a 12th century megalomaniacal emperor. So if you have any questions during the talk, please save them for the end and we will address them during the Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming Jeff Moser.
So thank you, Dani, for that very generous introduction, and thank you as well, and all of the members of your team for making it possible for me to be here tonight and to celebrate with all of you all the reinstallation, the wonderful reinstallation of the Asian art galleries. I'm visiting here with my students today, and we had an opportunity to spend several hours, several impressed, overwhelmed hours, looking at the art that's on show there. And the object that's going to be the subject of my talk this evening is displayed on the right-hand side as you enter into the first gallery in the last vitrine on the right. And I encourage you, when you have a moment, to find your way up there to take a look. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge some of the scholars whose research has contributed to what you are about to hear today. And I'm not going to read all of their names off here, but the research that I am about to present to you would have been impossible without the foundation provided by all of these scholars' collective intellectual efforts. Now, the bell in the Walters collection that is going to be the subject of our conversation this evening, and as I'm saying that, I should start my clock, is a plain, nondescript, simple, relatively unadorned object. Each side is adorned with 18 nodules set in bands of 3, framed by what appears on first inspection to be an abstract pattern of geometric interlace. This is an unassuming object measuring just over 10 inches in height, an object that really shouldn't attract a great deal of attention on first glance. But what we will find by the end of my talk today is that this little unprepossessing bell conceals within its fabric the traces of a body, an imperial body, and through that body, the traces of a tragic tale of megalomaniacal ambition and catastrophic loss. Now, to tell that tale, let's begin with what we can glean from an analysis of the physical bell itself. Now, the first thing that we can say is that it is not unique. It shares this basic design with at least 28 other surviving bells that are mostly in collections in East Asia, including the collections of the National Palace Museum, the Palace Museum in Beijing, and the Shanghai Museum, and a number of other regional archaeological institutes. And just so you get a sense of the kind of music that these bells produced, I've attached a small recording that's going to play for just about 30 seconds. And I should be very clear in saying that this is not the sound of these bells being played. None of these institutions let you hit their bells these days. But I included music played on replica bells of the same sort, so you can just get a sense of the kinds of sounds that are made with these instruments. Now, comparison with those bells shows us that the Walters bell is slightly incomplete. It originally had an aperture adorned at the top with a serpentine dragon-like form that you see in this example from the National Palace Museum on the right. The next feature that we note when looking closely at the bell is, oh, here's our detail showing the dragon. Even closer. The next feature that we note is that it has an inscription, and that this inscription is read in Chinese Nanlu. Now, Nanlu is a term that's utilized in classical Chinese musical theory. Classical Chinese musical theory, there's multiple versions, it's extraordinarily complex. I'm going to give you the simple version tonight, is that the basic notion is that an octave can be divided into 12 semitones, and that those semitones are divided into two groups, the 6 odd-numbered semitones, or lu, and the 6 even-numbered semitones, lu, which together offer the 12 pitch standards, or lu, which is a good phrase to practice if you're trying to get your tongue around Chinese. And that, in combination with a pentatonic scale, can produce up to 60 discrete pitches, with each of the 12 pitch standards serving as the basis for one distinct pentatonic scale. Now, all of these scales, and I should say here that the Nanlu is the 10th of these 12 pitch standards. Now, all of these scales depend on what is known as the huangzhong, the yellow bell. This is the absolute pitch. This refers to the absolute pitch of the first note from which all other pitches are calibrated. All right, so that's what the bell tells us about how it fits into musical theory. And the third thing that we can say upon inspection is that this bell, and in fact all the bells like it, bear a striking resemblance to earlier bells. Specifically, a group of 6 bells that are illustrated in an antiquarian catalog entitled The Revised Illustrations of the Manifold Antiquities of the Xuanhe Hall, that was completed in the year 1123. Now, this catalog tells us that these bells were discovered in the early 12th century in the Yingtian region. Yingtian means responding to heaven's mandate. And this is where the founder of the dynasty, the founder of the Song dynasty, a general named Zhao Kuangyin, had begun his rise to power. Now, this prefecture had a historical name, and that historical name was Song, as it happens the same as the name of the dynasty. And it had 2,000 years earlier been the domain of Duke Cheng of the state of Song, whose name is inscribed on each of the bells. Now, despite this outward similarity, close comparison between the 12th century bells on right and left and the much earlier bell in the middle reveals some striking discrepancies. And the main thing that we see is that the interlace ornament on the Duke Cheng bells is looser and bolder and clearly zoomorphic, containing animal forms. The sort of dragon tiger creatures at the top of the bell are much more naturalistic in our 12th century examples, with a sort of pebbled or scaly skin, while those in the illustration are decorated with the geometric patterns of squared off spirals. Here's another detail so you can see the difference. So the challenge for today, the mystery to unlock, if you will, is how do we explain these features? The fact that the bell was part of a much larger set, the fact that it bears a musical notation, and the fact that it appears to be closely modeled on ancient bells, but nevertheless differs from those bells in key respects. Now, this mystery deepens when I tell you that the bells that we are looking at here date to the 12th century, which is nearly 2,000 years later than the bell illustrated in the middle. How, and most importantly, why, did a 2,000-year-old bell come to be remade in the 12th century? Now, to understand the stakes of that process of recasting, I have to tell you 3 stories. And the first of these stories is a story of symbols. Now, this story concerns cauldrons, and you'll see how cauldrons connect to bells by the end of this talk. Now, the first thing you have to know about cauldrons in ancient China and in medieval China is that they move, and they do so under their own volition. They're animate objects, despite how stable and solid they might appear. Bronze cauldrons fly through the air, they float up from the bottom of rivers, and they emerge from the earth of their own accord, as many historical texts tell us. Now, the textual record of early China is replete with stories about the legendary 9 cauldrons, purportedly fashioned by the legendary King Yu, a great of the 22nd century BCE, somewhere around there, a great hydrological engineer who famously channeled the waters to make the land habitable and agriculturally productive. The cauldrons were said to have been passed down through successive rulers of the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties until they were lost and sank into the Si River in the 4th century BCE. Now, according to these early accounts, the number of cauldrons derived from the number of regions of the known world that Yu had demarcated by leveling mountains and channeling watercourses and establishing the appropriate tribute that each of these 9 regions would pay to his state. Now, one of the most revealing and influential stories about the 9 cauldrons hails from a text known as the Zuozhuan, the tradition of Zuo. It tells us that in the year 605 BCE, the ambitious lord of the southern state of Chu conducted a campaign against barbarians in the vicinity of the Zhou royal capital. Now, recognizing the campaign as a thinly veiled effort to demonstrate the strength of the Chu armies to the militarily weak royal house, the Zhou ruler dispatched a minister to greet the lord of Chu. And upon receiving this minister, the lord of Chu famously inquired, "What is the size and weight of the cauldrons?" Now, given the fact that his army was presently camped on Zhou royal territory, the message of the question could not have been more obvious. The Lord of Chu wanted to claim the mantle of rule by acquiring the 9 cauldrons for himself. Now, in response to his threatening query, the official replied, "What matters is virtue, not cauldrons." In ancient times, when the Shah had achieved the height of its virtue, the distant regions made pictures of their things and presented metal in tribute to the 9 governors. The ruler Yu caused cauldrons to be cast, bearing images of these things. In this way, the 100 things were completely enumerated, and the people made to recognize all the spirits and malign beings that beset them, so that when they traveled over river and marshes and through mountains and forest, they would encounter no adversities, and the demons and monsters could not harass them. When the virtue of the Shah became murky, as it often does at the end of a dynasty, the cauldrons moved, again of their own accord, to the Shang royal house, and for 600 years the Shang ruled. But because the last king of the Shang was cruel and oppressive, the cauldrons moved to the Zhou royal house. When virtue is commendable and brilliant, even small cauldrons will be weighty. They will stay where they are. And when affairs are crafty and deceitful, even large cauldrons will be light. Even though the virtue of the Zhou has declined, the mandate of heaven, this mandate granted by heaven on virtuous rulers, has yet to change. And the minister ended his comment, his response by saying, the time has not come to ask the weight of the cauldrons. Now, in this most famous telling, the cauldrons embody the order of civilization and act out the will of heaven. Now, scholars have, since early times, generally interpreted the things represented on these bronzes as strange creatures, or guaiwu. One 3rd century commentator glossed Wu as anomalous things of the mountains and waters. Now, the safety that was achieved by representing these dangerous beings happened through a kind of epistemological authority of the ruler rather than some sort of practical dissemination of knowledge. The account offers no indication of how the people in each region saw the representation of the cauldrons in the capital, and there's no sense anywhere of how they might have learned from these cauldrons the information that they provided. Instead, protection was generated simply through the process of naming each of the dangers in turn and then immobilizing them in the metallic matrix of the cauldron. In this way, the demons were literally objectified, transformed from inchoate things lurking on the edge of consciousness into identifiable subjects against which one could act. In the process, the subjectivity to royal authority, structured through Yu's demarcation of the land, was symbolically represented through his denotation of the land's dangers. Now, this process of making the world governable by making it knowable was realized precisely at the moment that the formless metals that had been submitted as tribute from the peoples was cast into the matching matrices of the 9 cauldrons. Metaphorically speaking, the demons represented on the cauldrons were thus both monsters beyond the boundaries of civilization and also the incarnate memory of who the now civilized subjects of that empire once were. In submitting their metal as tribute, the people are symbolically submitting themselves for sculpting into worthy and worthwhile subjects. Casting, as such, is not incidental to the making of didactic models, but the very means by which fluid savagery is channeled into governable form, according to the political theory that we're hearing here. Now, by materializing the wider process of subjugation in which it participates, the casting of the cauldrons is, in a sense, a synecdoche for the creation of civilization itself. Now, after the casting was complete, after the hot metal of the 9 regions had cooled into stable, civilized bodies, the cauldrons nevertheless remained in motion. Moving first from the Sha to the Shang and then to the Zhou, they tracked this mandate of heaven. Now, the connection between the movement of the cauldrons and the legitimacy of the ruling regime survived the Zhou. A later account, the records of the Grand Historian, includes an account of what happened to the cauldrons as the Zhou declined. According to this account, after the altars were lost in the year 336 BCE, the cauldrons registered heaven's displeasure by sinking into a river near the city of Pengcheng. Now, how they came to be at Pengcheng, which is hundreds of miles from the Zhou capital, is not explained. And thereafter, the story becomes even more complicated. One passage in the records indicates that when the Zhou declined, the cauldrons traveled to Qin, the founders of the first empire in Chinese history. But elsewhere, it relates that in the year 219 BC, 2 years after defeating his final adversary and declaring himself the first emperor of a reunited China, the ruler of Qin sent 1,000 men to try to raise the cauldrons from the river. That effort famously failed, and the Qin collapsed soon after to be replaced by the Han. Now, as myth became history, the fact that the Han did not actually possess the 9 cauldrons generated a great deal of imperial consternation. Thus it was with great relish that Emperor Wu celebrated first, the recovery of a cauldron in the Si River in the year 116 BCE, and second, the discovery of a precious cauldron beside the imperial shrine to the god of earth in the year 113 BCE. And I should be clear here that these cauldrons are not those cauldrons. These are just cauldrons that I put up as a sort of visual point of reference. These have been discovered nearby in the same region, but in the 1970s. Now, in the absence of the 9 cauldrons, the discovery of ancient cauldrons anywhere in the empire became a sufficient substitute. At the same time, these cauldrons sort of became dehistoricized. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, what I mean is that they were transformed from a sort of mantle of rule empowered with a storied history into heavenly omens and portents that operated according to sort of cyclical, ahistorical logics of astronomical bodies, seasons, and ritual renewal. So they become, in a sense, omens that show up anytime rule is benevolent and morality is virtuous. Okay, so that's our first story. Second story is a story of scholarship. And this is a story that straddles the era between the end of the Tang Dynasty, between the 6th and the 9th, or the 7th and the 9th centuries CE, and the Song Dynasty from the 10th through the 13th. And it's a story that takes us back to the emergence of the field of epigraphy, what's called Jinshixue in China. And what we see in the 10th century is an increasing attention to the collecting of ancient inscriptions that are being circulated primarily in the form of rubbings. This is a wonderful example of that. It's an incredibly complicated story. I don't have time, but if there are questions during the Q&A, I'm happy to go back to it. What's striking about the 11th century is that what we see is this interest in collecting the texts of the past increasingly also involve an interest in collecting the physical traces of the objects upon which those texts are inscribed. A sort of new attention to the materiality of the text, we might say, a new attention to the physicality of the text as forms inscribed on actual physical material objects. Now, this interest encouraged a new kind of attention to cauldrons. Because many of these cauldrons bore texts inscribed on their surfaces. And this attention is recorded in texts like Lu Dalin's Illustrated Investigations of Antiquity. And through texts like this interest in antiquity began to be, or this interest in the objects of antiquity began to be extended to other sorts of objects that were similarly made from bronze, but were not themselves cauldrons. So, for example, we have here an example of a dray vessel, which Song scholars were particularly interested in objects like this, which they understood to have been used ritualistically in ancient times. And here's an example of the illustrations made of this, the wood block cut reproduction of a rubbing of the inscription on the surface of the vessel, and then the lengthy commentary that Lu Dalin wrote about this particular vessel. Now, for scholars in the 11th century, their interest in these objects was not what we would typically think of. We use the term antiquarian to describe them, but it's not antiquarian and just a sort of interest in kind of rarefied, distant, old sources of knowledge. Their interest was most focused on the fact that these objects were in fact, here's our gloss, were in fact ritual objects. They were associated with a concept known as li, which can be variously translated as ritual, ceremony, etiquette, or decorum. Ritual, as they understood it, was the means by which all under heaven was ordered. And as a text from the Record of Rites tells us, the way, virtue, benevolence, and righteousness cannot be enacted without li. Teaching, training, and the rectification of customs cannot be completed without li. Arguments, quarrels, debates, and disputes cannot be decided without li. The relations between ruler and minister, high and low, father and son, and brothers, old and young, cannot be determined without li. Li, in this sense, ritual in this sense, is the cornerstone for the construction of a virtuous life. And li is put into practice. It's implemented through the mobilization of the kinds of objects that these scholars are studying. Now, to give you a sense of the remarkable detail in this catalog, I just wanted to show you one other entry. And so a typical entry would include things like an illustration, a line-drawn illustration of the vessel, a name that was given to the vessel, often based on the inscription on its surface, a reproduction of a rubbing of the inscription in the classic bronze script that you see there, a transcription of that inscription into what was standard Chinese script in the 11th century, discussions of where it was found, in this place, the region of Lantian, the dimensions of the vessel, the fact that it had an inscription, and then a comment on the decipherment of the inscription, the decipherment of the symbolic content of the vessel, its ritual function, its historical purpose, and so forth. All right, so that's our second story about scholarship. And our third story is a story about money. So if our first story was about the symbolic meaning of bronzes and casting, and our second story is about the rediscovery of ancient bronzes, then our third story concerns the hard reality, both fluid and fixed, of the material from which these bronzes were made. Now, the simple fact that bronze vessels were made of the same alloy of metals used to cast coins made them unique repositories of value. The transition from the Tang to the Song set the stage for one of the greatest socioeconomic transformations in world history, one so great that since the early 20th century, scholars have suggested that the Tang to Song transition in the 11th century marks the beginning of China's modernity. Now, we don't need to plunge here into the complexities of what it might mean to call the Song dynasty modern, but suffices to say that the 11th century experienced one of the most substantial and sustained periods of economic growth in the history of China and indeed in world history. A revolution in agricultural techniques generated a demographic explosion and facilitated the emergence of a complex commercial economy. Now, the increasing complexity of the economy generated a tremendous demand for currency. The Song regime attempted to unify a kind of heterogeneous patchwork of currencies that they had inherited into a single system based on the bronze coin as the basic unit of exchange. Now, numbers bear evidence to the extraordinary demand for officially minted coinage. The maximum annual output ever achieved by the imperial mints of the Tang dynasty was 327,000 strings of copper coins. In 996, even before the reunification of China was complete, the Song was already minting 800,000 strings annually. By 1007, the number was 1.8 million strings. Now, although limited resources prevented the Song mints from matching this number every year, they maintained a rate of at least 1 million coins annually up until the economic reforms of the 1060s, when production climbed to 5 million strings. Now, the demand of the commerce and the increasing monetization of state payments placed on Song mints was exacerbated by two major problems. The first is that just a huge amount of currency flowed out of China because markets across Southeast Asia, the rest of East Asia, started using Song coins without minting coins of their own. It was much more convenient to borrow the coinage than to actually spend the money to make it. The second is the fact that bronze coins were used as a means of tax payments and as a unit of account, forced the Song government to arbitrate the exchange value. But because of the high demand for bronze, the nominal value of the coins as currency, and this is the end of my economics, so don't worry. The nominal value of the coins as currency often fell below the real value of the metal in them. As a result, there was a tremendous incentive to melt the coins down. These twin challenges caused a succession of currency famines, which were most acute in the early decades of the dynasty, but which persisted thereafter as a chronic problem. The Song, over the course of a century, forbid the manufacture of bronze statues, pagoda, and other sorts of implements as a way to kind of control this problem, threatening those who violated the prohibition with death. The shortages were so severe that at the turn of the 11th century, the official penalty for secretly possessing any more than 5 caddies of bronze, a relatively small amount, was execution. Now, ironically, the demand for bronze seems to have increased the supply of ancient bronze vessels available for discerning collectors. One source indicates that the demand for bronze was so great that people started robbing tombs to find the objects found therein. And most likely, these tombs included the Shang and Zhou dynasty tombs where ancient bronzes like this were buried. Now, we tend to see this sort of Song collecting of antiquities, this sort of fascination with antiquity, as a pastime driven by a sort of yearning, a moral yearning for antiquity on the part of Song scholars and officials. They certainly want us to see it that way. That's how they talk about it in their texts. But it is important to remember that this passion was fueled by prospectors who were primarily not looking for ancient things, but for the metal that those things contained. Now, although the major 11th century collectors of ancient bronzes were almost entirely silent on the financial implications of their collecting, the fact remains that they were caught up in the inherent turbulence of owning metal in a metalist monetary regime. These liquid assets, in their most essential sense, persist as a problem throughout the later history of Chinese bronze collecting. To give you just one example, when currency famines again loomed by the mid-12th century, the emperor himself set an example by giving 1,500 bronze vessels in the court collection to the imperial mint for melting down. And this is where I come to my caveat about the bronzes that I'm showing you in the pictures and the bronzes that I'm showing you in the photos. Now, every time I illustrate a leaf from a Song antiquarian catalog, like this page, by showing the type of object being illustrated, I'm actually doing a bit of art historical sleight of hand. I need to add a caveat that the exact object that was being illustrated is not the one in the photograph. Why not show the same object in line drawing and in photograph? Well, the answer is actually very simple. Because with at most 2 or 3 exceptions, none of the nearly 1,000 discrete artifacts that are described in 11th and 12th century antiquarian catalogs survives to the present. Technologies of print and rubbing have ensured that the illustration of a bronze on the perishable medium of paper is far less fugitive than the actual bronze itself. Now, while the fate of each of these rediscovered but lost again bronzes cannot be known with absolute certainty, the evidence of Song hoards and literati burials suggests that a handful were intentionally reburied. It's safe to conclude that the fate of the vast majority of ancient bronzes discovered over the course of the pre-modern period was essentially the same as the fate of historic gold, silver, and bronze objects the world over. They were melted down into the raw commodity from which they had been forged. So for all of China's historical celebration of bronzes as revered cultural artifacts, the ultimate fate of most ancient bronzes was literal liquidation. And so it is all the more remarkable that our bells survive. And the fact that so many survive will prove even more remarkable to you when I tell you how it happened. Because as it happens, we know a great deal about what happened to these bells. And to do that, to tell this final chapter in our story, we must turn finally to the story of the person and the body at the center of our tale. And that is a man named Zhao Ji, the Emperor Huizong, who assumed the throne in the year 1100 following the premature deaths of his older brother and his older brother's infant son. Now, he came of age in a period of intense factional rivalry at court, factionalism that his father and his brother had contended with. And after a short period of conciliation with some of the officials who supported kind of the opposing factions that he was most affiliated with, he soon soured on the idea of getting along with those who disagreed with him. And in 1102, formally blacklisted these partisans in a manner befitting the knowledge that their cultural practices contained. He had their names inscribed on stone tablets that were set up throughout the empire. And having blacklisted these opponents and exiled those who remained alive, he undertook a series of a radical program of dynastic regeneration, embarking on a whole series of reforms that sought, in a sense, ultimately, to eliminate factionalism at the court by training officials to all think in the same way about problems. That's a sort of general way of thinking about it. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it'll do for our purposes this evening. This involved things like the creation of a new educational system of state schools that did away with aspects of the earlier exam system, which at least some of his opponents had understood as a mechanism for fostering creative, unconventional thinking. That wasn't the kind of thinking that Huizong was interested in. He was also interested in, most prominently, ritual reform, and this is where these stories coincide. Now, having consolidated authority over the rhetoric of state, the emperor embarked on an unprecedented program of ritual reform. Between 1103 and 1105, he oversaw the casting of a new set of ritual bells, these bells that we've been talking about, based on bells that antiquarians had discovered in the state of Song. And he used these for the production of a new kind of music, which he called the music of a great brilliance. And we know this in part because the bells were subsequently recorded in a court catalog of Huizong's collection, which is what we've been looking at here. Now, we know a bit about how he thought about this music. And this is actually quite striking. The first thing that we know is that he compared this music. He says in ancient times, Yao had these are ancient sage kings in high antiquity. Yao had the great arrangement and Shud had the great harmonies. The kings of the three dynasties each used different names as well. Now I have sought deeply into millennia past and established the musical system of our own era. This was in an edict announcing the new music. It is thus fitting that I bestow it upon it the name Dasheng, or great brilliance. Now, in this telling, both the forms of the orchestration and the name Great Brilliance are simultaneously new and ancient. The music featured novel arrangements. It was also based on the study of ancient bells, and its name was both unique and in alliterative harmony with the names of ancient orchestrations. Huizong echoed the patterns of the ancients by slotting his own names and substances into their categories. He also talked in a different edict about how he understood ritual and the idea that rites would be systematized according to the needs of the day, that thus the kings of the three dynasties not inheriting the systems of their predecessors was not because their ritual was fundamentally different, but because times had changed. Antiquity was long past. The standards of its courts and chariots, vestments and garments, functions of its offerings used in services and sacrifices, weddings and receptions had all assumed various names and forms over the intervening millennia. Now, the central claim that he's making in this kind of statement, and this is a much longer edict that I'm not going to go into, is that rites are supposed to change over time. The differences that one observes in the ceremonial practices of the three dynasties versus the present resulted from the necessary changes made to ensure the continued efficacy of those practices. Although antiquity presents a storehouse of potential models, as we see in the bells, and although these models can and should be put to use, it's practically impossible to perfectly recreate those implements, nor would it really be desirable to do so. Huizong later in this edict reminds his officials that adapting to change is the very definition of ritual. What this means in practice, as he goes on to explain, is that ancient vessels should provide models in some cases, and contemporary practices should provide models in others. And wonderfully, the emperor is the one who knows when. Now, this actually provides a way of understanding the difference that we see between the motifs on the models and the motifs on the actual cast bells, a sort of adaptation of classical forms to the decorative logic of the present, an elimination of the ambiguous zoomorphic motifs that we see here, things that gestured toward things that were mystery and strange, fell forces, and so forth. Those being replaced instead by a standard repertoire of known auspicious figures like dragons, or simply geometric ornament. So thus, what we're looking at, what looks like a copy on first glance, is actually a kind of creative adaptation of classical precedents. Now, and you can see here in the slightly more naturalistic handling of the dragon's scales by comparison with the geometric squared off spirals that we see on the model, that same kind of consistent logic of, trying to make a dragon look the way a dragon was meant to look if you were thinking about dragons in the 12th century. Now, the other thing that Huizong did spectacularly is he recast the famous 9 cauldrons of antiquity. And he did so on a massive scale. Now, we don't have the cauldrons that he recast, but we do have an example of a very small diminutive cauldron that he cast as a gift for the powerful eunuch general Tongguan. And I'm just going to leave that up there as a point of reference. As you can see, this cauldron is, again, closely modeled, but in fascinating ways slightly distinct from the Shang dynasty precedents that you see on the left. Now, unlike this little cauldron, which is only about so high on the right, the largest of the 9 cauldrons that Huizong cast was 9 feet tall and weighed something on the order of 100 metric tons. Huizong was literally investing an enormous amount of money in a symbol of the durability of his rule. Now, this was an extraordinary act. As we saw with the story about the would-be upstart asking about the weight of the cauldrons, because the 9 cauldrons were perceived to embody the mandate of heaven by moving in tandem with the virtue of the ruling house, the surefire way for a would-be ruler to demonstrate that he was not worthy of them was to go looking for them. Casting them, from the perspective of classically educated traditionalists, was really beyond the pale. Not only was Huizong presumptuously claiming the mantle of the sages, he was also more fundamentally erasing the very distinction between the ruler as the so-called son of heaven and the cosmic forces of heaven itself. If the sun could create the omens of his own virtue, he was in effect acting as a heavenly father to himself. Now, we don't know exactly how this was meant to work, but here's how the cauldrons relate to the bells. The text that we have associated with this retro reform suggests that the cauldrons were in fact meant to be harmonized with the bells. And it's not clear if this was meant in a scientifically harmonic sense that we would understand, in that the cauldrons themselves would be struck with massive gongs and their pitches coordinated with the pitches of the bells, or whether the harmony of the two sets of implements was really more sort of figurative and esoteric. But whatever the case, the two acts, the casting of the cauldrons on one side and the casting of the bells on the other, were linked as a single coherent act designed to generate harmony throughout the empire. And here we return to the Huangzhong, that keynote. Now, the Taoist adept Wei Hanjin, who suggested this program of ritual renewal, specifically this program of recasting the bells to Huizong, had to deal with two problems. One was the model of the bells that would be reproduced. That was established with those bells from the state of Song. The other was the sound themselves, that actual pitch. How would that ultimate pitch be determined from which all other pitches could extend? The bells didn't provide it. The bells were corroded. The bells were damaged. The bells were incomplete. You couldn't get the Huangzhong directly from the ancient bells themselves. So what did he do? Well, following the precedent of the legendary Yellow Emperor of antiquity, he proposed that the dimensions of Huizong's third, fourth, and fifth fingers would be taken as the standard measures for the pitch pipes that would be used for tuning the bells. In this way, the emperor's body was taken as the measure of the keynote, and on the basis of that keynote, as the measure of every bell in the music of great brilliance, and in the harmony between that music and the cauldrons, as the measure of the cauldrons, and thus as the source and the measure of the many omens of virtuous rule. One might say that by performing power on such a grand scale, Huizong was generating the measure of his own worth as a ruler. And for a time, this literally self-fulfilling prophecy from the emperor's perspective seemed to be coming true. He began a campaign of collecting fabulous rocks from Lake Tai in the south to decorate the imperial gardens, a campaign that involved the digging of new canals and the removing of bridges so that these rocks, these massive rocks, could be shipped to the capital. He presided over an academy of painting that produced some of the most finely naturalistic representations of birds and botanical subjects that China has ever known. He witnessed through this painting academy the recreation of archaic painting techniques that harken back to the Tang Dynasty. And auspicious omens came one after another, such as in 1113 when cranes descended on the palace, an event that was recorded in another painting attributed to Huizong. The attributions of these paintings are a fascinating set of questions, which I'm happy to go into if there's time in the Q&A. One official, Wang Anzhong, congratulated Huizong on a total of 50 good omens over the course of his reign, which included things like numinous mushrooms, auspicious metal, fine grain, the clearing of the Yellow River famously turbid ran clear, 5-colored clouds, auspicious movement of stars, unusual tree growth, white rabbits, a belt of vapor around the sun, the placidity of the Yellow River, solar eclipse that did not reach the predicted degree, and onward and on. But then it all began to fall apart. Huizong presided over a regime that was very good at finding evidence of its own goodness. One has the sense that the regime was better at finding signs of its virtue than at actually being virtuous. The problem is that this process simultaneously involved the silencing of countervailing opinion. Now, we can never know if Huizong's court might have survived the great catastrophe that brought it to the ground if the emperor and his chief ministers had done a better job of encouraging debate at court. What we do know is that what they did do most definitely did not ensure the longevity of his rule. And that sad story of how it did not work is the story with which I'm going to close today. And to tell that story, I have to show you a map that shows you the Song in the south and their major international competitor, the Liao, in the north. Here's a blow up so you can see the basic area that we're talking about in what is today northeastern China. Now, Between 1115 and 1125, the Liao were overwhelmed by a formerly subject people known as the Jurchen, and all 5 Liao capitals were seized. Now, initially, the Song thought this was great. They were thrilled with the idea that the Jurchen were rising up against their enemies, and they sought an alliance with the Jurchen from their capital, the Song capital at Kaifeng, to retake the 16 prefectures that had belonged to the Tang dynasty but had been lost in the interregnum between the fall of the Tang and the emergence of the Song. This had been sort of a major foreign policy issue throughout the entirety of the last century. And they succeeded very quickly in defeating the Liao, and the Jurchen initially allowed the Song to occupy the Liao's southern capital that you see there. But this had gone very, very easily for the Jurchen, and the Song really hadn't provided a lot of help. And so by the end of 1125, the Jurchen decided that in fact what they wanted to do was invade the Song directly. They turned against their erstwhile allies. In 1125, Jin armies besieged Taiyuan in the southern capital. The emperor abdicated as a sort of gesture of surrender. Qinzong, his successor, sued for peace. There was an enormous indemnity paid, which I won't go into detail on, as an attempt to get the Jurchen to leave. The Jurchen retreated finally in early 1126, withdrawing with several hostages and a tremendous amount of treasure. 9 months later, they were back with 100,000 troops, and real combat began on the 11th month of the year 1126. The inhabitants of Kaifeng were instructed to do things like keep the catapults supplied by taking those expensively transported rocks from southern China and flinging them over the walls at the Jurchen attackers. Various attempts at negotiations were made. One official recruited 7,777 soldiers to use magical techniques to make them invisible, which didn't work. And the Jurchen ultimately occupied the walls, burning gate towers, walls, and much of the city. Fleeing Song troops began looting the city. Thousands died in the initial onslaught. The well-to-do changed into poor people's clothes and hid. Thousands committed suicide rather than falling into the hands of the Jurchen. Court plots began to break out, and it was bedlam. Placards were posted by the invading Jin telling people to offer gold, silk, meat, and wine as rewards to their invaders to avoid execution. Markets in the city by this point in winter openly began selling human flesh. On the 30th day of the 11th month, Qinzong formally surrendered and offered to pay even more tribute, to which the Jurchen general responded, "Is there a person or an object that is not already mine?" Their demands continued: horses, 10,000 horses, all the weapons in Kaifeng. By the end of the 12th month, they were taking people: painters, winemakers, doctors, musicians, astronomers, weapon makers, masons, gardeners, jade carvers, clerks, painters, storytellers, scholars, Buddhist monks, etc., etc., etc. Somewhere in the excess of 10,000 prisoners were kidnapped by the Jurchen, including over 5,000 women, princesses, imperial consorts, performers, and prostitutes from the entertainment quarters. The wives, daughters, and concubines of Song officials were all carried off. It's believed that something in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of those people never survived the march back to the Jurchen homeland. Then, after all of that was taken, they went after the ritual paraphernalia, the 9 cauldrons, the ancient vessels, the books, documents, printing blocks, and indeed, the musical instruments of the music of great brilliance. Altogether, 3 months were spent stripping Kaifeng, the city of Kaifeng, of its assets. The temple devoted to the Song imperial ancestors was even stripped, including the clothing off the statues of the imperial ancestors. Now, this sort of, because the preservation of the state was likened to the preservation of these altars, this was a sort of catastrophic moment in the kind of ideology and the mindset for the Song. But as Patricia Ebri has noted in her detailed recounting of these tragic events, to their credit, when Huizong and Qinzong made pleas, it was always for the release of people, not for the return of things. But those pleas consistently fell on deaf ears. Now, the dynasty would ultimately reestablish itself and rule for another 150 years before being destroyed by the Mongols. And over the course of that history, some objects would indeed be recovered, including some of the bells from markets that the emperor set up along the border between the expanded state of the Jurchen and the sort of rump state of the song. Others were integrated into imperial collections that were transmitted from the Mongols to the Ming to the Qing and ultimately into the modern museums, where the bells are now located. But the story of that complex history of transmission, a history of the cauldrons and the bells moving once again, is a story that I'm going to have to leave for another day. But what of the story we've heard thus far? And what do we have from it in sum? We have a story about the deep historical symbolism of bronze cauldrons as mobile, animate objects of heaven's favor. We have a story of the study and the recreation of ancient bronze vessels by Song scholars looking for means to implement a moral life. And we have the story of the literal financial value lodged in the metal from which these moral implements were cast. And through all of that, through the mobilization of all of those precedents, we have the story of an emperor who drew upon all of that history and all of that tradition to recreate the rituals and the music of antiquity on a grand and unprecedented scale, and to seek through that great act of regeneration to create a dynasty that could somehow escape the vicissitudes of time. And we have seen how that all-encompassing pursuit of musical and political harmony came to a decidedly unharmonious end. And perhaps, just maybe, we've heard in that story the echo of a parable for our own times, a timely tale of ambition unchecked, warnings unheeded, and the peril of silencing dissent. And we have heard all of that resonating from the small and unassuming body of this modest little bell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was very fascinating. So we're happy to take any questions. Yes.
I'm wondering if you would go back to. Is it on? Oh. I'm wondering if you would go back to the issue of the ruler's fingers.
Sure.
And this question of, so I wish you would elaborate on that a bit, and its repercussions elsewhere. Because what I wasn't able, because I'm not in Chinese studies, was it the question of simply being a number of fingers wide, and so therefore he chose his own, or was it that there was something basically magical about the body of the ruler, and that other parts of his body, the height of his head, maybe his total height, things like that, became a sort of a set of standards for other manifestations?
Part of it, it's a great question, thank you. Part of it turns on the question of the units of measure. And because fingers were often used as a way of articulating the basic dimensions of an inch, it builds on that. But there are multiple standards of measure that are deployed at different times, and this is a specific standard of ritual measure. I mean, the primary reason that it's invoked in the song is that there's a very ancient story that this was how initially the bells were tuned in high antiquity. So the dimension that the fingers supplied is equivalent to essentially the length of the pitch pipe that would then be struck and that would then be used to tune it, or to tune the bells. Whether or not those same measures could be derived or would understood to have been derived from other parts of the body, I haven't seen discussion of imperial bodies as having that kind of sort of coherently coordinated quality, that you could somehow take the measure of the whole world by measuring the emperor's nose and the space between his ears and so on and so forth, although it would be fascinating if that was the case. Fingers seem to be a particularly valent source here, and so I think that's why it's being invoked. I don't know if that really answers your question, but one of the stories that's told is that in high antiquity, you didn't need this unit of measure because the sage kings were capable of just hearing it. And so what's striking is that by saying you need to use the emperor's figures, there's also an acknowledgement that these sensory capacities of rulers aren't what they were in antiquity. And so this is a way of kind of utilizing the sort of embodied measurements of a person as a kind of substitute for the declined sensory capacities of a slightly fallen age, at least rhetorically.
I wondered if there were intermediate copies of the book, and if there were significances to the times it was published between the 11th century and the 18th century.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, as you probably saw, maybe I go back, but there's what I was showing you there are actually 17th and 18th century copies of that book. The real scholar to consult on this one is Xu Yahui at National Taiwan University, but I will do a poor job of trying to represent what she's done in her close textual study of all of those books. They were reprinted. The first printing of Liu Dalin's illustrated investigations of antiquity actually happens in the Northern Song, but that version doesn't survive, although we have a close copy of it that we know from the preface on it. The earliest surviving edition of the Huizong's court catalog doesn't actually date until the 14th century. So there is a sort of, when we look at what's going on in these catalogs visually, there is a kind of problem of recension, of knowing the degree to which the images there, adequately represent the images that they were. Although I will say, looking across most of the editions of these catalogs, they're remarkably conservative. They do a pretty good job of reproducing the imagery. And I think we have a pretty good sense that the images that I've shown you here pretty closely approximate the quality of the images as they would have appeared in the 11th and 12th centuries. Not every edition of the catalogs is as high quality as what you've seen there. Some of them do have a much more simplified, sort of stripped down and even slightly cruder handling of the object. And why they do it that way, how that came to be, is actually really interesting. There's a whole nother story that one could go into here about the relationship between this kind of imagery that's an attempt to represent an actual object, and a different kind of ritual imagery that's also circulated in wide amounts that I haven't shown you here, which is attempts to take the names of implements that are preserved in classical texts for which images don't exist, and to sort of figure out a way to extrapolate visual forms from just those names. And that leads to a production of a certain mode of what I call lexical pictures, a certain kind of simplified imagery that is sort of stands in tension, in productive tension, with the antiquarian catalog imagery, and I think is responsible for some of the abbreviations that you see in certain editions. That was probably much more than you needed, but anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you all. This has been such a pleasure. And I first want to thank Jeff for being here and giving us so much more to think about regarding our bell that's upstairs on the 4th floor. Please go check it out. I also want to give a big thank you to our digital team, our IT team, and our special events team for working behind the scenes. A special thank you to the members of the Friends of Asian Art Group for making this program possible. And finally, a thank you to everyone here in the audience and those watching at home. We invite you to join us for our next program. And finally, in celebration of all things Asia, I wanted to announce that tomorrow evening is the start of the Asia North Art Festival. It will be held in the Station North Arts District with opening night activities at the Motor House. And there will be an exhibition with about 16 or 17 contemporary Asian artists on display. So please be sure to check out the festival. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.